Hello, Mark. It's
Uh,
good to see you.
It's great to see you, Leila. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. So my guest today is Mark Ainley, who is actually Vancouver-based, but internationally known for all his various activities. It's very difficult to, in a nutshell, tell you about Mark, but I can tell you that since his teens, he's been active in researching and listening to recordings, historical recordings of the piano. He's an absolute piano nut, or is the correct word to say pianophile. And his work, it led him to doing research in recordings and looking into the history of these recordings. And he is actually known now as the authority on the recordings and the life and history of the great revered Romanian pianist Dinu Lipatti, who lived from 1917 to 1950. Died tragically. I think he had leukemia, didn't he, Mark?
Yeah, Hodgkin's.
Hodgkin's, that's right.
Yeah.
And I don't know if an aspiring pianist anywhere in the world at any time since the 40s or 50s doesn't go through a Dinu Lipatti phase. At what stage did you discover Dinu Lipatti, and how did that grow?
It was this, again, like many things that show up in our lives, it's kind of accidental. It seems accidental, and in fact it wasn't. It was just seemed so perfectly timed. I bought a record for a piece I was learning and took it over to my piano teacher. And I was very disappointed because even with, I wasn't really trained as a listener, but the playing didn't sound very good to my ears. And she agreed. But the thing she commented on was, look how thin the record is. So you should see my 78s in my closet. And she takes me to her closet and she starts pulling down these big, heavy records, these big old albums. And there was these gorgeous hands on this cover. And it said, Rachmaninoff plays Rachmaninoff. And I said, wait, composers recorded? And I just realized I had no clue. I had in my head the image of, cylinders and scratchy old records, but I had no idea if Chopin or Mozart or Beethoven or any of these, I had no idea when the technology had started. And I was just intrigued naturally by the fact that, well, if we have these documents from composers, doesn't that give us something really important? Why is everybody not listening to these? And perhaps they were, but I wasn't at that point. So I just started listening to all these old recordings. So I just started going through record collections, and I went through the one in my high school music teacher's office. And there was a record, an Angel Records sampler that had a bunch of different tracks on it. And one of them said, from Dinu Lipatti's last recital. And I thought, well, that's kind of morbid. I mean, and you hear this title and you realize, well, obviously he's dead. And obviously this sounds kind of some historical thing if they're referring to it as his last recital. So I was just intrigued, and I asked my teacher, just my high school band teacher, I was like, well, who is this Dinu Lipatti guy? And she said, oh, he was a pianist's pianist. Everybody loved Lipatti. And as I started listening to more and learning about his life story, I said, well, he only recorded 3 hours. And there are all these radio recordings and unofficial recordings that started being released of these other artists in concert. And I was curious, well, there must be some of Lipatti. I thought very naively. And in my late teens, started phoning up embassies to get the addresses of European radio stations, because before the internet, that's what you had to do. Because they didn't have Swiss and German phone books lying at home. So phone up the embassies and I'd write letters. And that's how I started my research. And then one collector would introduce me to another. And long story short, I added about probably 3.5 hours to Lipatti's recorded output through my research. But most of my research was done in Europe. So he'd lived in Switzerland, and I met a number of his students and friends, and then started tracking down through the grapevine, you know, these collectors who had unique recordings, you know, in their basements, kind of thing. I mean, it's really like a spy story. And I was fortunate enough to be able to get into EMI's archives and read through the correspondence of what had been going on during his lifetime and afterwards, as others were looking for recordings, and it was phenomenal. But he's just one of the many musicians. You know, we think we're lucky because he had a recording contract and he was known. And what I started expanding into afterwards was there were loads of incredible musicians, and some of them died tragically, like Lipatti, from illness. Some of them died in the war, or some of them never even made an official recording, but there might be one or two broadcasts. And listening to all of these different artists, we can hear just so many wonderfully different and varied and insightful approaches to interpretation, as opposed to this concept of like one fixed, perfect way, even though ironically Lipatti is often held up as the perfect pianist and that his readings are perfect. I think that there's as we know, more than one way to feed a bird.
So this notion of perfection, what the hell does perfection mean?
Well, this is it. And this is what I was hoping we would talk about, because this is what I find so fascinating. And what you said about a CD, you know, this is interesting because, of course, I'm fascinated by recordings, and I'll be the first to admit that I think recording technology is one of the things that has had perhaps the most adverse impact on the concert experience and even on the interpretation of music. In your interview with Stephen Osborne, you were discussing, you know, what if you did a live recording? And he said he would feel too nervous doing that. And why is that? What is this fear of, you know, of making a mistake, and when that kind of thing creeps into artistry? So so I'm interested in this whole notion that, you know, the recording was, as the technology's improved and sound has gotten better, it seems to have, for a number of people, it's become more attractive somehow to sit at home and just listen comfortably, rather than, oh, you have to go out and you park and you pay and you do this, and then there's a person coughing, and there's all of course we don't want now, and all of these kinds of things. And yet you're in the concert, you're in the same time and space as the person who's making the music, and the loss of that direct experience where the air, the actual sound waves coming from the instrument are in the same room as you, rather than, you know, something that was done perhaps in an antiseptic recording studio with no audience, where is that same fear that Mr. Osborne was talking about. What we've been listening to, and if that's what our ears have gotten used to, not just in terms of the perfection, the fact that they won't allow a mistake to be on a recording, but in terms of the sound quality, which is very different from what it is we're going to hear in a concert hall. And so one of the fascinating things then is listening to some historical recordings where in some cases they didn't care as much in the days before tape splicing and editing about wrong notes. And so we'll hear some of those mistakes, or we hear concert recordings by artists, and whether there's mistakes or not, I mean, we're listening to something absolutely transcendent, and it might not be their final statement. It might not be their, you know, this is it, but it was an in-the-moment experience that we have the fortune of being able to listen to again, because, you know, we weren't around to be able to hear Lipatti or Corto or Hoffman or any of these other greats from previous generations, Rachmaninoff. And so the recordings do help us, and yet it's a double-edged sword, because we still need to have that live experience to be able to really get, I think, the full sensory and in-the-moment experience of dedicated listening and focus.
Nowadays, you hear a lot of people who are supposedly in the know, saying how much better the sound from an LP is than the sound from a CD. Can you explain that?
Now, I don't know the science behind it per se, but I'll tell you that I do listen to vinyl still. I can't part with them. I had to part with a number of them because, you know, Vancouver square footage.
Yes.
But not my piano ones. So I've gotten rid of some of the others. There was so much warmth, and I think there's also the fact that like how it is that the recording is being made is something, you know, what are the microphones that are being used? What's the placement? And what's the aesthetic? One of the things I was just commenting on, I was listening to a new recording. I won't name the pianist or the label, but this label, I think, really shifted in the 1960s. You listen to the recordings they made in the 1950s, the piano sound is wonderful. And then in the 1960s, all of a sudden there's extra reverberation, like there's this echo that, you know, there seems to add, you know, atmosphere that's really inappropriate. So you lose clarity. And so some engineer who might not be musically trained is deciding what the sonic framework is going to be. Whereas really in the early years, and even in the, you know, the 20s and 30s through the 50s, a lot of these engineers were actually musically trained and they were music aficionados. And so the whole thing was very different. And I've posted on my YouTube page an interview with Anthony Griffith, who was one of EMI's recording engineers and with Columbia as well. And he was the engineer at Dinu Lipatti's last recordings and a number of other ones. And he was talking about some of what we've talked about, the sound quality as well, but also the fact that, you know, not having mistakes. He said Beecham, he did a lot of Beecham recordings, the conductor, and he said, we have to redo this passage because there was, you know, the ensemble wasn't really great in this one spot. The instruments weren't perfectly together, and this critic is going to point that out. And so we need to do it again. And he said they did it again, it was perfect, and the magic was gone. All of the magic was there in the first one that was a little less than perfect. But I think the quest for the perfect sound quality as well has, I think, taken away something natural. It's not what we hear in the concert hall.
I remember when the CBC used to record pretty well everything we did. And I remember when Sony Walkmans first came out, and I got my Sony, and I had these tapes from recordings of concerts that the CBC did. And I remember thinking on a number of occasions, I had been in the hall at the concert. And yet when I walked along 19th Avenue under the trees, listening to the same concert, it sounded completely different. And I remember raising it with Don Harder or Karen Wilson, who was the producer in those days. And she said, well, of course it's different because you hear differently when you see things. So I think that the process of integrating what you're hearing, the eyes also play a part in that, and the sort of the ambience affects it all, doesn't it?
Well, you know, you change one factor. This is the fun thing about science. You change one factor in a scientific equation, and the value of the whole equation's changed. So you change one number in a mathematical formula, everything's different. And so, you know, there is a science to acoustic. And this actually brings up something as well, because I think a lot of people, they like to sit on the left side because they want to see the hands. And I remember once going to Radu Lupu, whom I adore, at one of your recitals. And the only seat that was available was even further over on the right-hand side. And the sound, I was like, I don't care about seeing their hands. I don't need to see anything. I just need to listen. And it was like the sound that was coming out of the piano. And of course, Lupu produces a sound that I think is probably the closest thing that we've had in our century to the sound that Lipatti produced. He studied with the same teacher.
Yes.
The first time I heard him was in Lucerne. And again, when he sat down and I heard the first note, I just melted. And I was like, well, this is it. And that is the sound that these greats produced. And, you know, and he's been here in your series on our stage, and, you know, but having that experience, listening to that, I was just like, and the other thing is, there is not a single recording of him that's been made that captures that sound. And this is the thing, this is the big challenge. And this is why I think, as much as I am, you know, such an aficionado of these recordings, you know, I'm on a soapbox now, really, that people have to go to concerts. They need to hear things live. They need to have this live experience where you're actually having dedicated listening. And you know that Rachmaninoff refused to broadcast. It was in his contract. He was offered vast sums of money to have his concerts broadcast, and he said no. because he said he doesn't want to be there on stage and somebody at home is not, how are they paying attention? What's the level with which they're paying attention? And yet he made records. And that didn't seem to somehow, it can seem
Not
paradoxical.
Yes, yes.
And yet there were those who said, those who heard him in concert said he plays differently on his records. And it's not that he wasn't dedicated to, doing his best. But again, that whole challenge of, that fear of making a mistake or, having to do it over and over again until you get a correct version. And until recently, we had no sense of how different that might have been. And then just in the last 2 years, there's been the discovery of a recording of Rachmaninoff playing through his symphonic dances in Eugene Ormandy's living room at the piano that was recorded without Rachmaninoff knowing. And the freedom of his playing, you listen to this and you think, well, you can, as amazing as those 10 CDs worth of, 10 CDs worth of recordings that he actually produced in those days, over 100 years ago, this eclipses them all. And is so different. So for anybody that you're listening to, perhaps even a great like Rachmaninoff, how he was playing up close and personal was completely different.
Now, gosh, so first of all, let's just for 1 second go back to Radu Lupu. So I was at Carnegie Hall and I was sitting way up in the to hell and gone. And he came out and he played. He dresses in black. He sits on this black chair. The piano is black. The hall was filled. And he started to play and he made the hall get smaller and smaller and smaller. And it was just incredible how he brought the whole audience to his feet. And I don't know how an artist does that. I have no idea what it is that makes something magical. And I always say, for me, if I'm on a jury, and I've been on a number of screening juries for competitions, I simply look for magic. Of course, it's harder to find magic on a computer screen, but sometimes you can find it. You can find it. And it's that magical quality, that connection with the other people who are focusing.
Yeah. I think a lot of it comes down to, they don't necessarily know, they're not necessarily intending to create magic per se. I think that they're getting out of the way with their intention to do what they're doing. And there are a number of different intentionalities that I think can both serve and also not serve. I think that serving the composer's intention is one of the mistaken notions of the music world, because we can't possibly know what their intentions were. And we might, in fact, and Boulette spoke about this, that a composer might spend a few days, a few weeks, a few months writing a piece of music. Now, if he's traveled around the world playing that piece of music for 25 years, 30 years, he might actually have been playing the music for longer than the composer was alive. He has a very different relationship with that music, and he's gotten to know it in a very different way, where is it really the wrong thing to recognize that this might actually work better if he just added that bass note or if he did something else? And that's, it's sacrilegious now. And yet, as proof of this, we can actually go back to Rachmaninoff, where Boulette was in the audience when Rachmaninoff was, not the audience, he was in the hall, when Rachmaninoff was rehearsing prior to the first performance of the Rhapsody on a Theme of Paganini. And it was his first time playing it with the orchestra. It was a rehearsal. And he said, this doesn't sound the way I thought, let's change this. And they made all these changes in the moment, which never made it to the published score because the score was already published. And they made it into Boulette's copy of the score, and that's it. And so he said, as he would tell his students decades later, so much for the urtext, so much for the sacrosanct printed text. Yeah. So we can't really know what the composer's intention is. The best that a performer can do is to serve the music, serve the composer, serve the piece as best they can. And I think if they're however dedicated they are, and then whatever mastery they have technically and interpretively, and hopefully not feeling restrained by the circumstances, the fear of making a wrong note, or the piano, or the hall, or the crinkling of the wrapper, or whatever, then the magic can happen. But I think if you set out to create magic, I'm not sure that it necessarily happens. I think it's just in that being in the moment with one's craft.
After Lipatti, my next god was Solomon.
Yeah.
And then, you know, I only discovered Annie Fisher in about 1981.
Right.
And I had tapes. I mean, I had her Mozart concerti tapes, and I used to walk around with them all the time, say, I want to be buried with these, you know. She played the Waldstein here, and it sounded, I thought I'd never heard the piece before. It was just so.
That's what they do. And this is where, you know, we can get back to Solomon as well. You and I, as we know, we can talk for hours. But when it comes to interpretation, you know, you had mentioned in your talk with Filippo, you know, isn't the highest aspiration to actually for the musician to, in a sense, almost disappear, and then the score where you're just left with the music. And
that's
yet,
yeah.
And yet, you know, you listen to Annie Fisher, you know it's Annie Fisher. You listen to Solomon, you can almost tell it's Solomon. With Lipatti, 100%, you can tell within 3 notes that it's Lipatti. And I've had unpublished Lipatti recordings before that I've played for people, and within, you know, a few seconds they said, well, this is Lipatti, but he didn't record this. What is this? They could tell. And so is it not this, it's this magical fusion. I think some of the magic is that fusion between the artist and the music, as opposed to just one or the other, where the artist obscures the music, or then the, you know, the artist is, I think modesty is important, and there's a level of self-effacement where there's that humility before the music, and at the surface of the music, where they, you know, the music can then reveal its riches. But I'm not sure if it's from the artist disappearing. And Annie Fisher certainly didn't disappear. Nor did the cigarette marks that she left. The cigarette marks. They kept on asking her to sort of please not put her cigarettes, you know, on the edge of the piano. And yet, you know, there's this momentum that it's like, you listen to it, it's like, that is Annie Fisher. There's this drive, and it's somehow, it's never harried. And yet there's just this infectious momentum that she would bring. And then Solomon, there's this auric glow that would come out in his readings, especially, you know, of course, before the stroke, but I think you can even hear in some of his later recordings before his 1956 stroke, he wasn't quite as at the top level. You listen to what he did in the 20s, 30s, and 40s in his very first recordings, and it is the most staggering playing. And yet, again, it's him, and it's the music, and they're inextricably linked. And so, and we never know when the magic is going to happen. So this
of course, you know, that exactly. And I mean, that's my philosophy with everything I do. And that is, and when you buy tickets to a concert, you never know.
You don't.
And this is a risk.
This is it. And this is again, so one of the ideas that I had in mind for our conversation today. You know, I had no idea who Andrea Lucchesini was. And so I said, well, you know, I'll go, program doesn't, I don't know who Dario is. I'm not, you know, it doesn't really strike me. You know, you brought him for this concert. And the day before he was doing a masterclass. And I went to the masterclass, and I've never been to a masterclass where the teacher could so precisely give the one step that the student needs in order for their playing to take that quantum leap. It was so incredible. I was like, I have to go hear this guy play. I don't care what he's playing. And it was the most magical concert, the way he was alternating these modern pieces with Scarlatti.
Yes, yes.
And I wrote you this letter afterwards saying, very old school, wrote you an email, saying, well, you know, my God, I thank God. I almost didn't go because of my preconceptions of the repertoire. And these preconceptions of, this is what I like. Well, guess what? Everything that we like now, at one point we didn't know. It was new.
Yeah.
There was a first time for everything. And your, in a sense, I think your role, to go back to another point that you made that we didn't fully develop, in terms of the, you know, the salons where these old concerts were being held. They were not in big concert halls. Chopin and Liszt and all of these artists were playing in salons, in living rooms, and people were often talking, and it was not as respectful as what we might be doing here. But there was something intimate about it, and that was part of the magic, was the setting. And I think that any organization as well, that becomes part of it, where you provide that experience for the artist and so on. But we still never know. And so if somebody doesn't, maybe the performance isn't to your liking, then we have Arthur Schnabel's advice, the great pianist who made the first Beethoven sonata recordings in the 1930s, when he was applauding and his friend next to him said, "Why are you applauding such an awful performance?" He said, "I'm applauding Beethoven."
Oh, what a good line. Okay.
Isn't that amazing?
No, that's terrific.
That's what we're doing. And so we're going, and it might not be to our liking, and oh well. But we go and we have the experience, and it helps us to, I think, also examine what it is that we like and why. I'll share another story about Rachmaninoff.
And then I think it's time to wrap up.
Then I think it's probably time for us to wrap up.
To wrap up this section.
That's it. I was giving a presentation at the university here on historical recordings, and I played 3 different pianists playing the same Chopin nocturne. And I started with Rachmaninoff. And the students said, "Oh, his rubato is so extreme, the way he stretches the phrase, the way he slows down, it's so extreme." And I said, "Well, are you sure that yours isn't? And is there any guarantee that if you heard a recording of Chopin playing, that you would like it? And if not, what does that suggest in terms of who are we serving and what are we serving?" Rachmaninoff was born, just a few decades after Chopin died, and we're still playing his music. And we can think that our approach is better. And I think this is what it revealed. I'm not saying that you have to do what Rachmaninoff is doing. He was a product of a different century. But if we don't listen to it and then start to examine, well, why do I consider that kind of expression to be not to my liking, or it is, or it's not? We can start to listen a second time, let your reaction subside, and then listen again. And it might be like you were saying, even with listening to those cassettes afterwards, you can listen to a concert recording afterwards and you can have a very different impression. And that's the magic, I think, of, you're in the moment at the concert, and that's a never to be repeated moment. And whether you like it or not, you're still, again, you're there serving the music, and you're experiencing the music, and sharing this experience with other people. And isn't it amazing? Like you were saying, all these people come together, all these people from different backgrounds, different lives, all these different universes in one space.
Yes. Experiencing
something. And I think that's probably something now is, that's not possible for us to gather physically in the same space. And we can use these interfaces, and it's wonderful that we have technology serving us.
Yes,
I think everybody is clamoring.
Oh, definitely.
To have that shared experience of enjoying the music together.
I mean, the only thing I know is we cannot bring Lipatti back live. And how can we bring Solomon? But please, God, we'll find a vaccine.
But that's how, exactly. And that's where we have the recordings. And that's where we do what we can. And even if that's a pale imitation, Dame Myra Hess, another legend. She thought she hated recordings. She's like, oh, maybe one of them is okay. And of course, we revere all of those. Yes. And then you listen to her in concert and you hear, oh my God, it was even greater. But oh well, at least we can listen to them. And then if we can go live, that's what we do, and we go to concerts.
And Clara Haskell. All right, another talk.
Another talk.
Another time.
Another time.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you,
Leila.
So much. Keep
Such
well.
a pleasure. You too.
Keep thinking.
Always.
And we'll talk again.
I look forward to it.